The most unsettling thing about moving a mountain of steel is not the noise, it is the silence. When you stand next to the tracks as standard freight blows by at 60 miles per hour, the earth shakes with a violent, chaotic clatter. But when the heaviest machine on the North American continent approaches, the chaotic clatter vanishes. It is replaced by a deep, agonizing, sub-audible groan. The public looks at logistics and assumes it is a game of speed. They are entirely wrong. True industrial supremacy is a game of surviving mass. I have stood on the crushed granite ballast and watched bridge girders bow under the pressure. The strangest part is not waiting for the steel to snap. It is the realization that the cargo we are moving is so unfathomably dense, it literally alters the center of gravity of the track itself. To keep the lights on for 300 million Americans, we cannot rely on standard hardware. We require a tactical leviathan, 36 individual axles, 1.5 million crushing pounds, one vital nuclear payload. We require the Schnabel rail cruiser. But what happens when you put a 1.5 million pound weaponized transport on a rail network built a century ago? And how do you force a rigid, 400-foot-long spine of iron to snake its way through the jagged rock cuts of the American West without ripping the tracks straight out of the bedrock? There is a place in the canyon where the rail bends so tight you can hear the ballast grind before you see the rock. I walk beside the Schnabel, boots sinking into crushed granite, radio pressed to my jaw. The payload, 800 tons of nuclear-grade steel, hangs inches above a ledge that would shear a standard car in half. The manual says we have a quarter-inch to spare. The laser rangefinder blinks red, 7 millimeters, maybe 6. I whisper the number to myself, barely breathing. The car groans, a sound you do not hear so much as feel in your ribs, low, almost subsonic, like the earth warning you that it has had enough. I count the steps between the load and the canyon wall. Each one is a risk. The hydraulic arms are supposed to shift the reactor 40 inches sideways, but under this much weight, the trunnion pins scream. I trust the steel more than the paperwork. There is a moment, just a heartbeat, where the gap closes to 5 millimeters. That is the margin. One bad weld, one missed calculation, and the rock wins. I radio the axle count to the engineer. 36. Every one matters. Every one is a bet we placed against gravity, and today, gravity is not bluffing. Clipboard in one hand, I stare down the numbers that have haunted every mile since Charleston. 36 axles, 1.5 million pounds. I run the math again, just to feel the weight settle in my bones. 1.5 million divided by 36, 41,667 pounds for every axle. That is not a number, that is a threat. The rails beneath us were never meant for this. Each axle presses down with the force of 10 pickup trucks stacked end to end, and we are gambling that the ballast holds, that the ties do not shear, that the steel does not remember its fatigue history at the worst possible moment. I call the figure out over the radio, voice flat. 41,667. The engineer repeats it back, but I still do not trust it. I picture the load map, every wheel set, every cross tie, every bridge girder absorbing its share of the punishment. If just one axle sinks too deep, if the subgrade shifts, the whole equation collapses. There is no forgiveness in this math. We built a train that should not exist to move a reactor that should not be moved, and every number on this sheet is a dare. I stare at the sum, pen hovering. How does any car survive this? The answer is not on the clipboard. The first time I saw a flat car snap under a reactor load, I was a junior, just a clipboard, a radio, and a front row seat to the limits of American steel. The paperwork said the frame was good for 500,000 pounds. The paperwork lied. The welds let go with a sound like a rifle shot. Steel webbing peeled back, girders buckled, and $1 million generator hit the dirt like a dropped anvil. The old heads called it a learning experience. I called it a warning. Archival photos do not do justice to the violence. You see the aftermath, crossbeams twisted like ribbon, deck plates sheared, ballast cratered where the axles punched through. In 1967, a reactor vessel out of Oak Ridge made it less than 40 miles before the car failed. The investigation found fatigue cracks spidering out from every bolted joint. No one had run the numbers for dynamic loading on a curve at 6 miles an hour. They just trusted the math. In 1972, a shipment bound for Diablo Canyon left a trail of broken tie plates and ruptured bridge timbers across 3 states. The load map showed a perfect distribution on paper. The real world did not care. Every time a flat car failed, the blame settled on the usual suspects: subgrade too soft, welds too cold, bridge rating out of date. But the truth was simpler. We tried to move atomic age mass on rolling stock designed for boxcars and grain hoppers. A 1.5 million pound reactor does not care about tradition. It wants to go straight down. The more we spread the load, the more we found the weak link: axle bearings overheating, frames bowing, bridge spans flexing until the rivets wept rust. By the late 1970s, the verdict was in: flat cars could not survive the atomic era. The physics had outgrown the hardware. The only way forward was to build something that did not pretend the load was cargo, but made it the backbone. That is how the Schnabel was born, not out of ambition, but out of failure. We needed a railcar that could carry the weight of a reactor without lying to itself. Blueprints don't sweat, but I do. I've got the pattern sketches for the Schnabel's split consist design jammed in the back of my clipboard, the lines already smudged from too many nervous thumbs. 2 halves, each with 9 trucks and 18 axles, built not to cradle the payload, but to become its exoskeleton. The load isn't cargo, it's the spine, the only thing keeping the train from folding in on itself. The trunnion assemblies, perched like mechanical knuckles above the frame, do the impossible. They pivot and suspend 1.5 million pounds between them, the whole car hinging on a pair of 3-inch pins that look, in the cold, like the only honest part of the design. Every ounce of reactor steel hangs from those pins. The manuals claim they are forged from a proprietary alloy, heat-treated, shot-peened, serial-numbered, and die-tested before every move. But no amount of paperwork can make me forget what happens if one of them shears. There is no redundancy. 1 pin, 1 payload, 1 failure point. The split consist is a breakthrough and a dare. The engineers called it elegant. I call it arrogant. The arms can rotate 45 degrees off centerline. The hydraulics can nudge the reactor 40 inches left or right on paper. In the field, every adjustment is a negotiation with entropy. The patent diagrams show perfect arcs and labeled tolerances. Out here, the only tolerance that matters is the one between steel and disaster. Lateral shifts and vertical lifts are all orchestrated by a hydraulic system whose fluid runs hot and whose seals are only as good as the last inspection. There is a number stamped on every trunnion, a silent reminder that someone somewhere signed off on the risk. I start to explain it over the radio, voice clipped, when a new sound cuts through the static, a burst of crosstalk from the bridge team up ahead. Their tone is wrong. It's not procedure, it's panic. My mouth goes dry. The blueprint in my hand suddenly feels like a confession, not a solution. I crush the radio to my ear, waiting for the word that tells me which side of the gamble we're standing on. The ritual starts before dawn, under the sodium glare of yard lights that make the steel sweat orange. I stand with the maintenance chief at the trunnion, clipboard pressed flat against my chest, waiting for him to finish his inspection. No one speaks. Every word feels like it might jinx the outcome. The pin, the one that holds the load, the one that makes the Schnabel more than a myth, sits in his gloved hands. 3 inches of alloy, stamped with a serial number and a torque spec that has been checked and rechecked since Charleston. I have seen men pray over less. He wipes it down with a rag that comes away streaked with red dye. Dye penetrant test, standard for every move. Tiny cracks show up as neon veins if the steel is tired, if the last 100,000 pounds were one too many. He turns the pin under the inspection lamp, slow, eyes narrowed. No one trusts the paperwork here. The manual says the pin is good for 1 million load cycles. The manual does not walk the ballast at 2 in the morning. The manual never saw a trunnion shear in the middle of a cut. He pulls out the micrometer, jaws clicking shut on cold metal. He calls out the number 3.002 inches. I write it down, pen shaking just enough to betray the adrenaline. If it reads high, the pin has swollen from stress. If it reads low, it is worn thin, one step from disaster. It is neither. It is perfect. Or as perfect as steel gets when it is the only thing between a nuclear core and 1,000 feet of rock. He slides the pin back into the trunnion, lines up the hole, and taps it home with a dead blow hammer. The sound is dull, final. He leans in close, torque wrench in hand, and sets the nut to spec. No more, no less. 600 foot-pounds, just like the stamp says. I watch the chief's hands, the way he checks the threads, the way he listens for a tone only he seems to hear. There is no backup pin, there is no second chance. If this one fails, the whole train fails. A metallurgist from the contractor stands by, clipboard of his own, watching every move. He signs the certification sheet in triplicate, initials the inspection log, and hands the folder to me. His voice is flat, almost bored, but I can see the sweat at his hairline. He knows what is at stake. I know what is at stake. The chief gives me the nod. I radio the engineer, trunnion pin certified, torque verified, die test clear. We are green to move. I wait for the chief to pack up his kit before I step past the trunnion. I touch the pin just once, like a charm. It is cold. It is real. For the next 100 miles, that is all the certainty I get. I hand off the clipboard, take a breath, and give the order to crawl. The hydraulic arms hiss awake, and the whole train shifts, as if the canyon itself is holding its breath. The inspection is over. The gamble begins. The hydraulics don't care about nerves. They respond to pressure and heat, nothing else. I stare at the analog gauge bolted to the frame, watching the needle creep up with every micro-adjustment. The canyon air is cool, but the fluid inside those lines is not. Every time I call for a sidestep, 3 millimeters, maybe 4, the system groans, and the infrared gun spits out a new number, 178 degrees, then 184. The manual says 200 is the ceiling. I don't trust the manual. I trust the smell of scorched oil and the way the actuator skins hiss when the sun hits them. I radio the engineer. Hold, reset telemetry. The answer comes back clipped and flat. I wipe sweat from my eyes. The payload hangs above the rock, the hydraulic arms flex to their limit. The center of gravity drifting half an inch off the axis we mapped in Charleston. The math says we have margin. The ballast says otherwise. I run the numbers again, tracing the center of gravity drift on my clipboard, a pencil line that wobbles with every thermal spike. The reactor doesn't care about my calculations, it wants to go down. Each adjustment is slower than the last. The hydraulic fluid thickens as the temperature rises, response time stretching from seconds to eternity. We crawl, pause, crawl, pause. The rhythm is all wrong, like a heartbeat skipping in your chest. I call out the countdown over the radio. 3 seconds to actuation. 2, 1. The arms twitch, a shudder running through the frame, and the payload inches sideways. I check the readout, 193. We're close. Too close. There is no backup on site, no salvage crane waiting around the bend. If the hydraulics seize, if the last actuator fails, we are dead in the water, 800 tons of nuclear steel stranded in a canyon with a 1/4 inch to spare. The manual says there is a hand crank for emergencies. I have seen it once, rusted and forgotten, bolted to the side of the frame. No one wants to use it. You only go to manual when the system has given up, when the heat has won. I can feel the pressure in my jaw, the radio pressed so hard it leaves a mark. The engineer asks for a go. I hesitate. The infrared gun blinks again, 196. The margin is shrinking. I call for a full stop. The canyon is silent except for the ticking of cooling steel and the distant whine of a relay resetting. I walk the length of the car, counting every step, every breath, waiting for the hydraulics to surrender. The only thing left between us and the abyss is a crank, a prayer, and the hope that the steel remembers how to hold. A reactor core moves in silence, 1.5 million pounds of steel and uranium inching across rails first laid when Teddy Roosevelt was in office. Every mile, every bridge, every crossing, each one is a calculation, a risk measured against the need for certainty. The grid doesn't care about the sweat or the strain, and it demands megawatts, uninterrupted. 20% of the nation's electricity comes from nuclear power, and every watt relies on machines that can't be built or repaired without these heavy lift moves. The number, 20%, sits on my clipboard, a reminder that a single misstep could leave a city in the dark. Most people never think about the axle counts, the bridge ratings, or the fact that a single failed shipment could ripple through the grid for months. They flip a switch and expect the world to obey. We built a rail car that shouldn't exist to move a payload that shouldn't move, and that's the backbone of the American grid. The more invisible the work, the more essential it becomes. Someone should remember what it takes to keep the lights on. Someone once told me, every mile is a bet against physics, and physics never forgets. I keep that line tucked in the back of my mind, somewhere between the torque specs and the emergency shutdown codes. Out here, risk is not a calculation, it is a companion. We do not move a reactor like this because it is safe. We do it because the alternative is to let the grid flicker out, to let the work of a decade rot in a silo. The margin is not comfort, it is necessity. I walk the length of the Schnabel, boots crunching ballast, counting the silent votes of every bolt and weld. This car is the answer to a question no one wanted to ask. How much danger are we willing to accept to keep the lights on? There is a paradox in the steel, one I cannot shake. We built a train that should not exist to move a reactor that should not be moved, and every mile we roll is an engineered gamble, one that trades certainty for possibility, safety for progress. Some nights I wonder if it is worth it. If the numbers on my clipboard are really proof of competence or just a ledger of near misses. The manuals talk about safety factors and redundancy, but the truth is simpler. Every decision lives on the edge of the possible. The only guarantee is that we are not guaranteed anything. I radio the engineer, voice flat, and say, "Proceed at risk." The words hang in the canyon, unanswered, and I wonder who gets to decide when the risk is too much. Maybe that is the real job, knowing the odds and walking forward anyway. I still hear the trunnion pins scream at night. They say the steel can hold, the hydraulics will flex, but the truth is, we built a train that shouldn't exist to move a reactor that shouldn't travel. Every crossing is a bet against gravity, fatigue, and human error, and the grid keeps demanding more. The margin for failure gets thinner every year. If you have thoughts, drop them below.